Chapter 6. So I won one and I lost one. Both walkers and reeds, as I later discovered. When one of Camilla's younger sisters came to call a few days later, were willing to support my bid to host Allpack. But Justin had sent out invitations before I thought to do so, and my gut said that I wouldn't be able to garner enough additional supporters during the next few weeks to reclaim Clan Wilder's former place in the regional arena. As a result, even though my father growled in protest, I decided to take a slower approach to my goal, ceding the field to Justin for the time being. I was confident that, as long as I was able to hold my own within the Wilder clan, my relatives and I would be able to claw our way back to the top of the werewolf social heap given enough time. So for now I'd stay focused on getting Haven's internal affairs in order. The chief clearly wanted to argue the point, but our pack's former leader had exhausted his ability to shift into human form during our two previous confrontations, and a lack of human words meant that he could no longer micromanage Wilder affairs. So even though my father's occasional loop-in presence was a damper on the Yahoo's good spirits, we all enjoyed a bit of breathing room during the weeks that followed. But I missed Wolfie. I hadn't realized how much strength I'd been drawing from our regular phone calls until they were taken away, and without that release, I instead ended up spending hours every day running through the woods in loop-in form just to maintain my own sanity. Everything was simpler when I donned fur, decisions narrowing down to simple branches in the physical trail, rather than consisting of treacherous choices about how to manage my uncles and what to do at the upcoming Allpack. It was a relief to submit to my wolf's simple mind, her loop-in brain uninterested in worries about what the future would hold when the present offered open woods and endless trails for our fleet feet. It also helped that I felt closer to my mate in wolf form, even though the two of us were hundreds of miles apart, with my father continuing to stand between us. I could remember running through woods much like these with the bloodling Alpha by my side, and if I closed my eyes now, I could almost hear Wolfie's paws thumping across leaves in tandem with my own. The memory made my loop-in and human brains unite in shared joy, and our daily runs made up, at least in small part, for the cold loneliness of our bed at night. So when I returned home from the woods 1 week before Allpack, my mind had stopped racing and my face was serene, until, that is, I smelled the faintest hint of leaf mold and pine needles intermingling with the aroma of stew bubbling away on the kitchen hob. Immediately my hand stilled on my shoelaces and I strained to determine whether the addition of gunmetal was also present within the barely discernible aroma. But rather than catching Justin's signature aroma, I instead realized that the air was filled with the cool odor of peppermint, and when I turned I found a female face instead of either of the sets of male features that I'd been expecting. The stranger was about Blaze's age, but she and the Yahoos shared no other traits in common. Instead of rowdy good spirits, this young shifter looked poised to flee, and a glance at her inner wolf confirmed the sentiment. Physically, my visitor reminded me more of my third cousin than of the Yahoos, since both women were sleek and polished, but there was none of Camilla's exuberance about this girl, and I couldn't help thinking that my visitor looked more cat than wolf. While I perused her form in silence, the peppermint-scented youngster clutched a book to her chest like a shield in an attempt to block out the terrifying world. And if I'd been feeling kind, I might have turned away then and given the girl space to build up her courage. But something about the stranger set my teeth on edge, so I just waited, and finally my guest unclasped her hands wordlessly and held out the text like an offering. Even as her arms stretched toward mine, I noticed that my visitor kept her gaze firmly anchored on the floor, her eyes never once meeting my own. And after spending days guiding alpha-leaning wolves who didn't want to follow my lead, a submissive wolf like this should have soothed my soul. So why did my hackles raise at her mere presence? Taking my attention away from the girl at last, I found that the book was a gift inscribed by my mate, which softened my expression at last. So Wolfie had received my note. Or if not, he still trusted me to stay by his side, regardless of the rumors that must have been swirling through the nearby packs. By this time, werewolves were inveterate gossips, so I wouldn't have been surprised if Justin and I had been married and expecting a child according to the rumor mill by this time. It said a lot about my mate's strength of will, that he'd sent me a gift rather than showing up in anger on my doorstep, an eventuality that I'd half hoped for, even though Wolfie's presence would have tossed both my and my father's plans out the window. The thought made me smile, and I ignored the girl in order to open my mouth and fully savor my mate's aroma as I read his words. The whole pack misses you, but I miss you more. Wolfie had penned with a firm hand, then he'd signed his name with a muddy paw print. P.S. The inscription continued. I'm sending you trouble, but you can handle it. As I read the brief note, my usually patient Wolf had risen up to guide our shared body, taking the lead even though we were currently standing on 2 feet. Perhaps because of that lupin dominance, I found myself far less interested in the so-called trouble, and far more interested in the scents still swirling around the room. Wolfie's vague missive hadn't presented the whole picture at all, and my Wolf and I inhaled deeply once again in order to fully capture the odor rising off the pages in front of us. In the process, we discovered that aroma of pine needles and leaf mold on the title page was emanating just as strongly from the girl who was waiting in front of our eyes. My Wolf growled at the realization, and I let the canine have her head, watching our visitor skitter back until her legs bumped up against a straight back chair. Neither my Wolf nor I liked what we smelled, and the girl understood without words that she was less than welcome here in my family home. Why the unkindness toward a young shifter who clearly wasn't out to cause any trouble? My Wolf's anger had arisen because, as Wolfie's note had opined, the girl herself was trouble. She was trouble because werewolves' signature aromas tended to run in families, and I couldn't quite make myself believe that my visitor was Wolfie's sister, especially since my mate had never mentioned the existence of such a sibling. Instead, while the girl shared 2 of her 3 scents with my mate, she looked nothing like Wolfie young, which seemed to leave 2 possibilities for the source of the familiar aroma wafting from her form, neither of which made my Wolf any happier. My visitor must be Wolfie's daughter, or his mate. As I ran my eyes across the girl's quivering form, I could hear the yahoos drift into the room and quieten as they came to the same conclusions I had. But then my human half peered more closely and saw something else. And my Wolf settled down inside me with a tongue-lolling grin. Perhaps this girl wasn't that kind of trouble after all. Although her Wolf was too submissive to discern mine, my visitor was perceptive even while two-legged, and I could see her slender shoulders relax just a hair as my lupin half calmed down. I'm the trouble, the girl said softly, still not quite meeting my eyes. Her feet were pointing toward the door, and I could tell that she was poised to flee, so I softened my stance at last and reached out to take her hands in mine. Welcome, trouble, I greeted her. I'm Tara. For a moment everyone in the room went stock still, the yahoos gaping in shock both at what they thought Wolfie had sent me and at my anticlimactic reaction to his surprise. I took advantage of the pause to glance over their heads to where Cricket was hovering in the doorway, and I sent the older woman a quick smile to stay any explanation she might have wanted to offer up. Of all the shifters present, my stepmother was the most likely to understand why we were smelling Wolfie's scent on this girl, and the older woman's tentative smile confirmed that fact. Chances were, Cricket even knew this young woman's name and pedigree, a name that I had yet to determine, so I turned my attention back to trouble, and raised one eyebrow in question. I'm Sarah, the girl said at last, becoming more timid by the moment as the yahoo's scowls darkened further. My Wolf could scent their anger from across the room, and when I heard mutters emanating from the young adults, I knew that Blaze, as usual, would be the first to break. No way, the youngest shifter exclaimed, striding forward and grabbing the girl's shoulders to spin her around. Sarah went limp in his grasp as if she were used to being manhandled, and I would have stepped in if I'd thought that Blaze had a single violent bone in his body. But instead of striking out at our guest, the yahoo just leaned down to sniff his way across the woman's body, sticking his nose deep within the folds of her baggy clothing. And as Blaze sleuthed, his anger turned into confusion. So I wasn't at all surprised when the young man's nose reached Sarah's midsection and stuck. When are you due? I asked. At the same moment the realization of the odor's source dawned upon Blaze, and I thought the room itself exhaled in relief. I was the only one who could see the tiny spark of life within our visitor's belly, but each of us could discern its scent, that woodland odor that had tricked us into drawing the wrong conclusion moments earlier emanated from the tiny wolf pup cradled inside Sarah's womb. New Year's Day, Sarah murmured, her eyes still firmly focused on the ground, and I almost laughed at the way Blaze leapt back, as if being pregnant were a disease he just might catch from standing too close to the mother-to-be. "And who's the father?" demanded Fun, asking the question that was clearly uppermost in all four of the Yahoo's minds. Justin, I thought with a smile. I was confident in my guess even though I had a hard time believing that any alpha would be harsh enough to cast off a mate. 8.5 months pregnant with his first child. Still, if my shameless flirting had been in any way responsible for Justin's decision, then I was glad that the mate in question had wound up on my doorstep. I wouldn't let Sarah fall through the cracks. But my smile faded fast when my visitor finally gathered up her courage and answered the Yahoo's question with a name I hadn't expected at all. "Wolf Young," she said quietly, and then the room erupted into yells. None of us was pleased by the accusation, but to my surprise it was my mild-mannered stepmother who shifted into lupin form and lunged at the girl. I'd ever wondered whether Cricket really cared about me, or whether she simply put up with her mate's offspring for Chief Wilder's sake. The speed with which the older wolf barreled across the room would have proven the shifter's affection. Luckily for everyone concerned, though, Cricket's emotional transformation had resulted in a wolf tangled in human clothing, so she fell flat on her face mere inches from our visitor's shins rather than achieving her goal of tearing out the girl's throat. At the same moment, Blaze was lunging toward my stepmother in an unexpected show of chivalry. "Stop!" he commanded, thrusting bare human hands toward my stepmother's gaping lupin jaws. "He told me to say that, but it's not true." Sarah's high voice rose above the melee, and I was glad to see that the girl's words had a calming effect on the combatants. Because, while I could have shut the struggle down with one alpha bark Cricket and I didn't have that kind of relationship, and I hesitated to mark the older woman as an underling by forcing her to submit to my will. So, it was a relief when my stepmother instead sidled away of her own volition, leaving Blaze to stand alone beside the self-proclaimed trouble. The girl who drew all of our eyes had ended up standing on a chair in her effort to escape, and she now towered above us, her baby bump very much in evidence now that her clothes had twisted to one side. I wanted to ask about the he who had commanded Sarah to lie about her baby's paternity, but the girl continued speaking without any prompting on my part. "Justin said to tell his brother that Wolf was my baby's father," the girl said, her voice trembling as she edged further away from us, nearly tipping over the chair in her impulse to escape. And although everyone in the room was listening, the girl's face remained tilted toward mine. "But your mate only laughed in my face when I told him, and said that anyone who truly knew him knew that his name was Wolfie, not Wolf. And when Wolfie sent me here, he said to tell his mate the exact same thing." The girl's eyes met mine for a split second before skittering away as her voice became quieter and more ashamed. "I didn't want to, but Wolfie said that it was only fair given the rumors that he'd heard." "Nearly too quiet to hear," Sarah finished. "And then he said that his mate wouldn't believe me for an instant. But I had believed. For one split second I truly thought that Wolfie might be this baby's father. After all, when the child had been conceived, my mate and I hadn't even met, so what was to stop Wolfie from finding a beautiful young shifter like Sarah attractive? He might not have even known that she was pregnant when he left, so having an unwed mother turn up on his doorstep 8 months later wouldn't discredit Wolfie as a gentleman. Not if he did the right thing and stepped up to be her mate after finding out about his impending child. That was. Justin had clearly felt the same way I had, coldly setting up his wife as a spy to be inserted into his brother's pack. And his gamble would have worked on most single male alphas, since werewolf society expected those hotheads to run a bit wild in their youth. The average unmated alpha shifter wouldn't really expect to remember every girl he'd slept with over the last 9 months, and for this type of alpha, Sarah's scent alone would have been sufficient proof that he was the father of her unborn child. But, of course, Wolfie wasn't that kind of alpha. I should have known my mate far too well to think that he would use a girl like Sarah for simple physical pleasure, then drop her without another word, and I was ashamed of my own gullibility. Even worse, I knew that my inability to see through what Wolfie had clearly considered a joke boded ill for my future career as a conniving pack princess. Which was all beside the point at the moment, though, because the more relevant matter was the very pregnant young shifter who had taken one look at Cricket's angry countenance and finally managed to topple her chair over backwards. The girl's arms pinwheeled as she tried to regain her balance, and everyone except my stepmother sprang forward in an attempt to break her fall. But we were all too late, because Blaze had swooped the girl into his arms and was carrying her up the stairs toward my bedroom without permission from me or from anyone else in the room. Tara has an empty bed beside hers, the Yahoo said quietly to the girl he was cradling against his chest. And you need to lie down. And weren't interesting times growing more interesting by the moment? Chapter 7. When I finally calmed the other Yahoos sufficiently to follow Blaze up the stairs, I found the youngster holding Sarah's hand as she lay curled into a ball on my spare bed. A few minutes of quiet should have relaxed our visitor. But, if anything, she looked worse now than when she'd been facing off against a pack of angry werewolves. In fact, it soon became apparent that my plan to welcome Sarah and then get back to work on all pack preparations would be soundly dashed. What were you thinking sending a pregnant woman off on her own? I chided my absent mate, especially when she clearly needs to see a doctor. Despite being an alpha male, Wolfie wasn't usually oblivious to social intricacies, so it was surprising that he hadn't taken advantage of his access to the only werewolf-approved medical doctor in the region when this pack princess showed up on his doorstep. My brother-in-law Dale lived right over the mountain from my mate, and the doctor was clearly Sarah's best option for prenatal care. So, why hadn't Wolfie chosen to keep his brother's mate close by? As I wavered in the doorway, unsure of what to do with a very pregnant, and possibly ill shifter, our guest whimpered and her face abruptly lost all color. Beside her, the strangely devoted Blaze seemed torn between taking the girl into his arms or taking to his heels, and I didn't blame him one bit. Childbirth among werewolves was terrifying, with 1 in 10 women giving birth to wolf cubs, bloodlings, rather than humans, resulting in very high mortality rates for mother and child alike. And since pregnant shifters couldn't risk being treated in hospitals, other complications abounded, making a werewolf's chances of survival even more slender when the time came to give birth. Most female shifters my age wouldn't have been quite so horror-stricken at the idea of being in charge at an imminent birth, but I wasn't a conventional shifter. When I'd escaped the wilder pack to live among humans, I'd been too young to have assisted at any births, so the only delivery I'd been privy to had been my own mother's ill-fated attempt to bear a son. I hadn't been in the room to see the furry bloodling come out from between my mother's bloody thighs, but her screams of agony had filled the entire house, and the sound haunted me to this very day. And since I'd never set eyes on my mother's smiling face after she disappeared into that delivery room, who would blame me for wanting to run as fast as I could in the other direction when our guest cupped her swollen belly and whimpered with pain? Unfortunately, unlike Blaze, I was supposedly in charge around here, so it seemed that I would soon fill those gaps in my education. Do you think you're experiencing contractions? I said at last when Sarah continued to emit quiet, wolf-like whines, her head now turned toward the wall. I didn't really know how to tell if her child's arrival was imminent, but surely the teenager would be aware of what was going on within her own body, or at least I hoped so. Sarah didn't pretend to misunderstand, but to my surprise the girl shook her head adamantly. Tears were coursing down her face and she was clearly in pain. But our guest appeared convinced that she was not giving birth. And while I was able to stand up to angry werewolves twice my size when it came to illness, I was a pure coward. So, with a quick explanation to the two young shifters curled atop the bed, I backed out of the room and ran for reinforcements. My stepmother would know what to do. No, I'd never heard Cricket speak so sternly, not even when Brooke and I had snuck out of the house one night to tag along on an illicit hunt planned by our male cousins, all of us coming home naked in the back of a patrol car in the early hours of the next morning. Even in times of stress, my stepmother had always been calm and collected, full of caring despite not being entirely keen on physical displays of affection. So I'd assume she'd be glad to help our guests feel more comfortable. But you know what they say about assume. That girl is not staying under my roof, Cricket continued, and I was glad that none of the yahoos had followed me into the kitchen in order to watch my dressing down, because my usually gentle stepmother now had steel in her voice, and she spat out words as if they were unripe persimmon pulp, so bitter that the flesh made her mouth pucker in distaste. She's a manipulator, my stepmother proclaimed, and I don't want that kind of malice in my house. In fact, I'm surprised you're letting that bitch stay in our village. Cricket. I started, not sure how to break through the rigid posture that had engulfed my stepmother's wolf, because as I peered through her human skin I could hardly believe my eyes. Cricket's lupin half actually appeared to be growling. If that wasn't out of character, I didn't know what was. Still, I had to at least try to appeal to my stepmother's rational side, so I continued. Sarah needs our help. What she needs is a swift kick in the pants, Cricket replied, speaking over me in yet another uncharacteristic display of temper. Two unrelated female shifters sharing a house was often a recipe for disaster, but the two of us had been managing quite well up until this point, since we were both very careful not to step on each other's toes. As the Wilders pack leader, my word was technically law, but this was Cricket's home and she was my father's mate, so I was used to letting the older woman have her way. And over the last few weeks, peace had been maintained largely because Cricket was so malleable. As long as the yahoos and I didn't track too much mud over her clean floors, my stepmother appeared to be quite happy to cook and clean for any number of guests. And maybe that was the problem. Perhaps I'd pushed things too far by turning the older woman into an unpaid housekeeper for myself and 4 rather slovenly yahoos. No wonder Cricket had finally cracked. We need to pitch in more around here, don't we? I asked, hoping that I'd found the root of my stepmother's displeasure. Maybe you're sick of having the guys camp out on your couches? Or of the way they like to leave the toilet seat up and to drop their wet towels on the bathroom floor. I didn't blame my stepmother one bit. If that was the problem, I was growing tired of living with 3 young males as well. And luckily, the yahoos in question tended to obey direct orders, so it should be relatively easy to get the household back onto a more even keel. So Cricket's anger should have been easy to diffuse, if the yahoos had indeed been the problem, that is. But apparently they were not. No, my stepmother contradicted, squashing that line of questioning with one curt word. I enjoy having a full house and don't have a problem with any of those kids. But I have to put my foot down when you tell me to house a snake under my roof. Then the same timid woman who had frequently asked, rather than told, her stepchildren to use their inside voices spun on her heel without further explanation and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. As the crash reverberated through my bones, I stood with my mouth gaping open and tried to gather my splintered thoughts before the yahoos could come to investigate. Figuring out what bee had gotten into Cricket's bonnet would have been nice, but the more pressing issue was, how could I handle Sarah without my stepmother's usual motherly advice? Taking a deep breath, I looked around the kitchen and decided to start with a mug of herbal tea, to which I would add plenty of honey to take the edge off any lingering shock. Then I'd see about moving Sarah into one of my cousins' houses, making plans to drive the girl to my brother-in-law if and when her condition made proper medical care necessary. So I guessed I could handle a terrifying pregnant woman after all. But it sure would have been easier if I'd had Cricket's help to fall back on. Any guest of yours is welcome here, my Aunt Bev said kindly as a cluster of young werewolves showed up on her doorstep an hour later. After sipping her tea, Sarah had seemed well enough to walk, and since I wanted to avoid another confrontation with my stepmother, I transferred our guests' housing to the top of my priority list. Cricket's house was now out of the question, so Bev's domicile seemed like the best solution to my newest problem. My mother's sister, Aunt Bev, had lived alone with her son David for over a decade since her husband died, and I had a feeling that the plump shifter wouldn't mind one bit if Sarah spent the next week in her spare room. The older woman was my favorite aunt, a cheery, good-natured soul who acted as unofficial haven midwife from time to time, and her son David could be counted on to treat Sarah fairly as well. Between them, mother and son should be able to keep both Sarah and her baby healthy, while also protecting the duo from any malicious acts on the part of more hidebound villagers. All things considered, I felt comfortable leaving Wolfie's gift in their care. But despite feeling that the 2 relatives would make good hosts, I'd brought all of the yahoos along for moral support as I helped Sarah up onto Aunt Bev's porch. After all, my past experience suggested that there might be something about our guests that set middle-aged shifters off into uncharacteristic bouts of rage, and I wasn't quite willing to risk facing Aunt Bev turned wicked witch of the West all by myself. Luckily, Cricket's reaction to Sarah seemed to have been a one-off deal. Come on in, Bev continued, holding the door open and not even batting an eyelash. when half of the yahoos promptly forgot to wipe their feet before they filed through the entranceway. Our hostess left us milling about in the living room for a moment, then returned with a blanket to drape around our pregnant visitor and a stool upon which the girl could set her feet. "When are you due, dear?" Bev continued, and soon drew out the same story that Sarah had regaled us with previously, but this time told more simply and with less dramatic impact since Bev didn't know Wolfie well enough to be protective of my mate. And once Sarah's tale was told, I was relieved to find that my aunt was quite willing to share the knowledge that she'd accumulated during her own pregnancies and while assisting at the deliveries of other members of the pack. Clearly, Sarah's medical issues would be easily diagnosed on my aunt's watch. But the older woman's face grew grave as Sarah haltingly concluded her explanation of the pain in her belly, a pain that had grown so severe at its peak that the girl thought she was being clawed apart from the inside out. "But I feel okay now," Sarah finished, one hand drifting down to hover over her enlarged stomach. I could tell that our guest would just as soon have let the past be forgotten in order to focus on hoping for a brighter future, but Bev had other ideas. "Well, we'll just take a look, why don't we?" my aunt said to the girl before turning to raise her eyebrows meaningfully at the yahoos. For young shifters peered back at Bev with the supreme obliviousness of youth, and I thought for a moment that I'd have to speak up and clue the youngsters in. But before I could open my mouth, Wade colored and did my job for me. "I think she wants us to go, guys," he suggested, "so she can look Sarah over." At Bev's confirmation, for youthful heads now turned my way, and I jutted my chin toward the door in confirmation. I figured that, even though werewolves didn't worry too much about group nudity, Sarah probably would feel more comfortable without a bunch of guys she barely knew staring at her naked belly. Heck, I'd feel more comfortable if I wasn't forced to see Sarah's pregnancy up close and personal, but we couldn't all get what we wanted now, could we? 3 of the yahoos clearly shared my trepidation, if the speed with which they headed out of my aunt's house was any indication. But Blaze hung back, unwilling to abandon the girl whom he'd rescued from my suddenly violent stepmother earlier that afternoon. "Do you want me to stay?" the yahoo asked, looking only at our guest rather than seeking permission from either his alpha or from the older woman whom he should by rights have respected. The action was my first indication that Blaze's crush was going to cause trouble, but I was more interested in ensuring Sarah's comfort at the moment, so I let the girl answer on her own. "No, that's okay," Sarah said timidly, her eyes fixed firmly on the floor. And since none of us could really tell from the girl's expressionless face whether she wanted Blaze to stay or go, I figured that decision was up to me. So I widened my eyes and lowered my chin meaningfully. And for a moment I thought Blaze might refuse my unspoken order. The yahoo glowered right back at me, and I began to count the seconds, hoping this wouldn't turn into a scenario where I would finally have to rebuke a member of Wolfie's pack. 5 seconds, 10, 15. And then, to my relief, Blaze dropped his eyes from mine, turned on his heel, and strode out of the room after his friends. So at least the yahoo wasn't untrainable, even if I could tell that Sarah's presence was going to make my role as the youth's alpha a bit more difficult for the foreseeable future. "Well, now that we have that settled, why don't you just lie down here for a minute?" Bev said kindly, arranging a pillow beneath Sarah's head as the girl stretched out on the couch. The older woman pushed up our visitor's shirt to reveal the girl's baby bump and began gently prodding her patient's abdomen. "Does it hurt anywhere right now?" the older woman asked as she worked, and Sarah shook her head in negation. "And you said there hasn't been any bleeding." I did my best to pay attention, but I ended up tuning out the 2 women as Bev's examination continued. There were just so many problems whirling through my mind at the moment: Sarah's health, the upcoming all-pack drama, and the ever-present power struggles within my own clan topping my list of worries. Plus, I really didn't want to think about pregnancy any more than I had to. Not when my limited experience with shifter childbirth had been so gut-wrenching. But sticking my head in the sand suddenly ceased to be an option when Bev's words sunk into my reverie. "I'm afraid your child is a bloodling," the older woman said a second time, and by the expression on Sarah's face, I suspected that the girl had already guessed as much. I, on the other hand, was so blindsided by what should have been an obvious diagnosis that I almost didn't hear Bev's explanation. All of that excitement must have made the baby shift into wolf form. My aunt continued, trying to keep her voice relaxed. But it was impossible to stay calm when all three of us knew what a wolf pup inside Sarah's womb meant. Women who bore bloodlings didn't survive. And most of the time neither did the pup. Chapter 8. My first impulse was to ignore my father's mandate and to drive Sarah to my brother-in-law's house immediately. But, as Bev explained after she'd tucked our guest into bed with a book and yet another cup of hot tea, it was best to keep the mother-to-be calm in an effort to also keep the wolfling sedated. Within her womb, both mother and child would have a better, if still slim, chance of life if the baby was allowed to grow all the way to term, so my aunt encouraged me to wait before moving our guest once again. "Are you sure?" I whispered, hoping that Sarah wasn't able to hear us through the two closed doors that separated my aunt and me from the object of our conversation. "Wouldn't it be better to just go for a C-section and take the baby out?" "I don't know anything about C-sections," Bev replied, pursing her lips contemplatively. "Although, wouldn't you have to keep the baby in some kind of incubator if you take it out too early?" My aunt made a good point that I had forgotten due to spending so much of my early adulthood around non-shifters. Werewolves' inability to take advantage of hospitals definitely worked against us if we were hoping to keep a preemie baby alive. But if a C-section was the only way to save Sarah, wasn't the mother more important than the child? "I don't really know if you're right or wrong," my aunt continued as I tried to work through the repercussions of various potential actions. "But I do know that, of the 5 women who bore bloodlings on my watch, the only one who survived was kept calm and comfortable until the baby was ready to come out on its own. And even though the other women died, they were fine until the day of birth." Bev's words carried more weight than mine in this department due to her vastly superior experience, so I conceded the point. "All right," I agreed, but I silently resolved to get in touch with my brother-in-law in the near future. Anyway, Dale had to be exempt from my father's restrictions against contacting my mate. After all, the man was wholly human and not technically a part of any shifter pack. Plus, I would completely ignore my father's wishes if necessary in the interest of keeping Sarah and her baby alive. So I agreed with my aunt's conventional wisdom and left our guest in Bev's capable hands. But I couldn't stop thinking about my own little brother, whom my father had drowned in the duck pond over a decade before leaving me without both mother and sibling alike. And I resolved then and there that, if I had anything to say about it, Sarah's family would never share the same loss that my family had lived through. Not on my watch. I wanted to make Sarah my top priority, but Allpack was now breathing down all of our necks. So after writing a letter to Dale begging him to make a house call, I started dealing with the looming issue of which pack mates to. My father had always made his selections look easy and obvious, but now that the choice had fallen into my own hands, I realized that every iteration was fraught with problems, both inside and outside our pack. Plus, the more I obsessed over whom to bring, the more it seemed that there was no single right answer. Just lots of wrong ones. The female component of our contingent was the easy part of my decision. Before I became pack leader, the only women who attended Allpack had been pack princesses, eligible girls of good breeding who went to the gathering in search of a mate. Each of these debutantes was traditionally trailed by an honor guard of 2 or 3 male shifters, and the princess and her entourage stayed at the gathering just long enough to enjoy the first 2 days of dancing and feasting before being spirited away back to her home clan. This year, though, there were no Haven Pack princesses to present since Wolfie had taken on the responsibility of managing my young relatives, giving me his yahoos in exchange. On the other hand, the male half of my invitation list was much more fraught with drama. Shifters considered it a great honor to be chosen to accompany the pack leader to our annual gathering, so all of my uncles and male cousins hoped to be selected. But I couldn't bring everyone because my father's honor guard had traditionally been made up of only a handful of men. The chief had used the laxness of his security as a backhanded method of asserting his own superiority over other pack leaders, the paucity of wilder attendants saying, "I am strong. I need no help to knock you down." And the plan had worked perfectly, with no one inside or outside of his pack challenging Chief Wilder. Until Wolfie and I came along to depose my father a few weeks ago. Unfortunately, the same precedent meant that, if I increased the ranks of the Wilder contingent at Allpack this year, then my actions would make me appear weak. An image I could ill afford since my sex already counted as one strike against me. On the other hand, if I brought too few guards, I might, in fact, be vanquished during one of the late-night skirmishes that were such a popular method of shaking up the power structure during all-pack. So it was a juggling act. Should I try to assert my dominance by minimizing my guard, or should I protect myself from attackers with the help of a slew of bulging biceps? In the end, I decided to gamble and follow my father's lead, choosing only 5 attendants just as the chief had done before me, and rather than submerging our pack in a bloodbath by dint of expressing favoritism, I also continued my father's tradition of letting the attendants choose themselves through their actions during a midnight hunt. The first 5 shifters to taste wild blood would attend all pack, while the losers would stay home with only their own lack of skill to blame for the exclusion. In the end, the only untraditional part of this night was a female wilder leading the pack instead of my father. Well, that, and the presence of the Yahoo fawn's naked breasts reflecting the light of the moon as the intrepid young woman stripped down right alongside the guys. "Look at those hooters," one of my cousins stage whispered, and I heard Wade growl as my other relatives snickered in response. The Yahoos and I all knew that my cousin's words were malicious, since even the most hidebound wilders should have been used to shifting alongside women, meaning that my relatives weren't just displaying typical testosterone overload in the face of naked female anatomy. Instead, the relative in question was making a point about where he did and did not want the gentler sex to intersect with his own life. According to Cousin Drew, a woman's place was barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. But even though I wanted to support fun, I placed a hidden hand on Wade's arm, rather than giving him his head. Like my choice of attendants managing my reaction to Drew's malice was like walking on a tightrope. I definitely wanted my cousins to get used to having women work and play alongside them in every setting, but at the same time I didn't want to speak up in Fawn's defense, because I knew that the tough young woman didn't need either me or Wade to fight her battles. By being silent, I let Fawn prove that fact to the relatives in question as well as to herself. So I chose the simpler path instead, showing my cousins how much faster I could shift, and thus how vastly my alpha powers exceeded their own. "Those distracted by their dicks will definitely lose out," I said simply, allowing my arms to fall toward the ground as my body changed seamlessly into Lupin form. Since following Wolfie's lead and teaming up fully with my wolf, the transformation that had previously been both painful and slow now came nearly as naturally as breathing. And as I settled onto my haunches and looked up at the 2-leggers behind me, I was pleased to notice that 3 of the similarly schooled Yahoos were among the first to follow my lead in donning fur. Only Blaze was absent, having chosen to watch over Justin's pregnant wife, rather than taking part in our midnight hunt. In contrast, Fawn, Wade, and Glenn had all sought my permission to attend, and I saw no reason to leave the young adults behind. Well, no reason except the need to find worthy prey, and fast, because my father had never allowed another shifter to beat him to the kill during a midnight hunt, and I could do no differently, not if I wanted to continue walking in the chief's shoes. So, rather than giving in to the impulse to bond with my companions by sidling up and rubbing shoulder to shoulder against their fur, I instead sniffed at the air and then took off at a lope into the hills. Our hunt had begun 50 miles distant from our village, up a winding mountain road where human residences were few and far between, and now it was time to take advantage of that seclusion by finding an animal that would be fitting prey for a pack of werewolves. As I raised my snout toward the sky, scents came flooding into my nostrils. Could smell my pack mates, of course, but my wolf soon picked out other aromas as well. Field mice and rabbits, those would have been an easy way to taste first blood, but I would also have become the laughingstock of the pack even as I enjoyed the animal's sweet flesh. Not much further away I picked out a deer trail, and I knew that some of my younger cousins would likely head in that direction, hoping that the ungulate at least possessed antlers to give their meal a hint of status. Deer were one of the tastier prey animals to be found in these woods, but no one who slaughtered a mere buck would be attending Allpack next week. There, the tiny thread of an aroma came spiraling down toward me from high in the craggy peaks of the mountain above. A cat larger than my most massive uncle, with claws as long as my human fingers and teeth as sharp as knives. The human part of me, which had worked as a naturalist for years and had protected various parks' flora and fauna from unruly campers, warned that Mountain lions were rare and should be left alone, but my wolf knew that only capturing the most daunting prey would serve to cement my own place as leader of the Wilder clan. So we shot one last glance back toward the relatives who were still twisting their way into lupin form, and we ran. By the time the mountain lion's trail began to freshen, I'd already heard the first howls of victory emanating from the woodland below. So my youngest cousins had caught their deer and would soon be feasting, making their group the first to shed blood during our shared hunt. But that was only a technicality, because everyone knew that the all-pack attendees would be chosen from the ranks of the shifters fanned out at my back, each of whom was now picking his way across the boulder field that lay between us and the feline's lair. We'd lost a few members during our wild run, either due to injury or exhaustion, and I hoped that our lowered numbers would simplify the upcoming kill. Glenn had fallen back out of sight after twisting one foot in a crack in the rocks, but Wade and Fun were still keeping pace along with 3 of my 5 uncles. Among my cousins, only 2 had been able to manage our mad dash up the mountainside, Bev's son David, and my malicious cousin Drew. After starting the night off on a bad foot, Drew seemed to have taken it upon himself to haze Fun whenever possible, bumping the female Yahoo accidentally, on purpose whenever we crossed open ledges, and once almost causing the smaller Wolf to tumble out into open air. During that incident, Glenn had injured himself while coming to his female companion's aid, and it had taken all of my self-control to bite down on a growl and to stop my wolf from spinning Drew head over heels until he submitted, then sending the troublemaker home with his tail between his legs. But Fun had told me this morning that she wanted to stand on her own 4 feet, and to win this battle herself. So even though my cousin's actions were patently unfair, I allowed the hazing to persist and simply increased my pace until Drew became too tired to cause any more problems. I did spare a bit of brainpower to hope that my cousin would slip and twist his own ankle so I wouldn't be forced to bring the bully along to all-pack, but I'd yet to achieve that yearn-for goal. We'd passed through 50 feet of rocky ground and were once again running flat out when my wolf swamped my human brain entirely. A head silhouetted against the moon, the cat came into view at last, perched 20 feet up on a horizontal limb of a tremendous oak. The feline was pitch black rather than showcasing the usual tawny coloration of most mountain lions, and her eyes were already trained on my pack of wolves, which made no sense. If our prey had known that we were coming for quite some time, why had she failed to run? The rest of us paused to assess the situation, but my malicious cousin ran up the base of the tree like a hunting dog, balancing on 2 hind feet as he bayed at the moon and made my uncles roll their eyes in disgust. Sure, our pack had gone hunting in lupin form, but the more intelligent shifter could still remember that he was a 2-legger as well as a wolf even when wearing fur. But we soon turned our attention away from my cousin and onto a more pressing question: which shifter would take on human form and brave the cat's claws on tender, furless skin in order to scare the mountain lion out of the tree? Fawn was 2-legged before I had fully considered the question, and Wade soon donned human form beside her. With the seamlessness of a well-oiled machine, the latter clasped his hands into a foothold and boosted the young woman up until she could swing herself onto the first broad limb. And then 3 things happened all at once. Chapter 9. The first occurrence of 3 was initiated by my Uncle Hawk's shout from behind our grouping. "There are cubs!" the shifter called, causing every head to turn in his direction. It seemed that my oldest uncle had wandered off and regained human form while the rest of us were perusing the cat in the tree. And in the process, Hawk had stumbled across the reason for our mountain lion's uncharacteristic behavior. She was a mother protecting her kids. No wonder our prey hadn't run away at the approach of a pack of wolves. I spared a moment to be grateful that Hawk had been the one to discover the mountain lion's lair, because Drew would have simply grabbed each kitten in his lupin jaws and shaken his head until the kit's delicate back splintered. Although not as high-value prey as their mother, the baby mountain lions were predators just like us and might have counted as a ticket to all pack. Murdering kittens wouldn't have garnered very high status within our pack, but the act might have been sufficient to gain entrance into the upcoming gathering back when my father was in charge. So a shifter like Drew would have gladly taken on defenseless prey for the chance to move up in our social hierarchy. But as I met Hawk's eyes across the clearing, I could tell that my uncle and I were of one mind regarding baby mountain lions. The initial adjective trumped the noun. In fact, I now regretted leading the hunt toward this cat in the first place, since our prey's kits would surely die without their mother's protection, which made me wonder whether it would be possible to deter my pack from taking down the mother mountain lion without losing face in the process. I suspected not, but resolved to try anyway. Even as my wolf and I began scheming how to let our prey go, an even bigger revelation walked out of the woods toward us. Surprising occurrence number 2 was a tall man who looked as if he'd hiked all the way up the mountainside, alone in the dark and in human form at that. But despite the fact that his clothes confirmed that our party crasher hadn't spent any time as wolf lately, the shifter didn't seem at all out of breath, and instead acted as if he were simply enjoying a stroll down a paved city sidewalk. As one, my pack and I each greeted the stranger's appearance by sniffing the air, and in the process I caught an odor that I'd only smelled once before in my life. The ozone scent of rain on hot summer pavement, the calling card of a bell. Bells were the most mysterious of the 4 powerful clans who attended all pack, and I guessed from our visitor's age and stance that this man must be their pack leader, the elusive Thomas Bell. Thomas Bell, never just Thomas, was the oldest alpha in the region, and he was arguably the most powerful alpha as well now that my father was gone. In fact, some thought that if Chief Wilder and Thomas Bell had been forced into a standoff years ago, then perhaps this quiet old shifter would have won the day. But neither alpha seemed inclined to test that supposition, and so my father had remained the host of all pack for my entire childhood. During those decades Thomas Bell had spoken, rarely, only opening his mouth when he really needed to be heard. So despite his power, the pack leader rarely came to mind. If flying under the radar was his usual MO, then why had the Bell patriarch hunted us down now, during a tradition that only had meaning for other members of the Wilder pack? As these thoughts flowed through my mind, the remaining wolves in my entourage were circling around to stand between me and the other alpha. But, although I appreciated their concern, I didn't find Thomas Bell particularly menacing. My father would have been livid at having his midnight hunt invaded by an outsider, but I was instead fueled by curiosity as I nudged aside 2 uncles, a cousin, and a yahoo so I could shift into human format, the front of my own pack. But before either Thomas Bell or I could speak, the third surprise came, soaring down out of the air to land amid our entourage of wolves and humans. The mountain lion had grown weary of waiting for us to leave her kits alone, and she'd decided to join in the fray. The cat touched down in the empty bit of space between me and Thomas Bell, and my eyes locked with the felines even as the other members of my pack surged forward to come to my aid. Our prey's muscles were taut, but something told me she was poised to leap away and return to her lair rather than choosing to attack this mixture of wolves and humans who had invaded her home turf. So, after sparing a quick glance to ensure that Uncle Hawk was out of harm's way, I barked out a command. Let her go. I was surprised at the timbre of my own words, since they had the same commanding ring that had come so often from my father's lips, but that I had so seldom been called upon to use myself. And just as when my father had bellowed, my command was instantly obeyed. Behind me my relatives all froze in place, one uncle even stumbling in his haste to halt an impending leap for the cat's throat. In that instant of quiet the mountain lion crouched and sprang again, this time soaring over Thomas Bell's head and disappearing into the darkness. I'd done it. I'd saved both the cat and her kits, and I felt my face relax into the first smile of the night. But my pleasure was short-lived. Fucking shit, Drew roared as soon as his muscles and vocal cords had thawed from the effects of my alpha command. My cousin's fists were clenched, and I could tell that the pent-up adrenaline from the night's events was catching up to him fast. Unfortunately, while the aftermath of our drama had left me shaky, Drew seemed to prefer venting his frustration in the form of anger. The chief would never have let our prey escape like that, the young shifter bit out. My cousin was right. Chief Wilder would have gladly torn the mother mountain lion into 100 chunks of bloody meat and fur. Then he would have taunted the kittens until they perished as well. Our midnight hunt had traditionally been a time to let our deepest, darkest predatory urges come out to play, and I'd known even as I commanded mercy that the Wilders would resent my taming of their tradition. This is what we get when a woman leads our pack, my 2 oldest uncles were clearly thinking, and while I couldn't quite tell whether Stony-faced David and the milder Hawk were also members of the Terrasux Alpha camp. I could tell that I needed to find a way to bring my relatives into line fast. But I also had other issues to contend with that were equally pressing. I shot a glance toward the visiting Alpha, whose face was just as expressionless as David's, and my shoulders drooped a little. Yes, letting the cat go was objectively the right thing to do, but my act of mercy definitely hadn't helped garner any much-needed support from the all-powerful Bells. I should have known better than to have taken my attention away from Drew, though, as a gasp from behind me proved, leaving my back exposed to the more powerful Alpha. I whirled and found the worst image of the entire hunt seared into my eyeballs. I could only guess that Finn must have slipped down from her perch on the tree during the recent commotion, and now that our prey was gone, Drew had opted to take out his aggressions on our party's physically weakest member. Dropping back into wolf form, he should be exhausted after so many transformations in fast succession, I thought inanely. My unpleasant cousin lunged at the female Yahoo and caught her upper arm in his strong jaws, and just as I turned at the sound of Fawn's gasp, Drew bit down hard, the crack of breaking bone ringing loudly across the clearing. My father would have halted the current craziness with one short bark, much like the one I'd used to allow the mountain lion to escape. Heck, no one would have even considered fighting while the chief was around in the first place. But instead of speaking, I stood frozen, two dueling sensations turning my legs to jelly and staying the words before they could leave my throat. First came the realization that I could feel Fawn's pain whirling through my own body, another surprising side effect of being pack leader. The physical agony was intense, but more punishing was the realization that my own wolf refused to put her power behind our shared voice. Not our pack, the canine growled, turning her back on the scene of carnage in front of us, and I could see her point, not being particularly keen on accepting Drew as part of my family at the moment either. But couldn't my wolf also see that if I opened my mouth without her consent, the Alpha command that had so easily rolled forth earlier would be absent from my tone? And if we failed to command Drew to halt, then the young woman who had become one of my closest friends would continue to writhe in agony. To make matters worse, werewolves can't stand a power vacuum. The instant Drew sprang, every eye turned in my direction, but when I seemed either unable or unwilling to respond, my packmates quickly took matters into their own hands. Wade didn't even bother to shift back into lupin form before wrapping his powerful arms around my cousin's furry throat, and to my profound relief, David sprang forward on 4 paws to help the Yahoos as well. But it wasn't a simple matter of 2 against 1. Hawk was still on the other side of the clearing, but my 2 older uncles saw no reason not to take a stand, and to my chagrin, they clearly sided with Fawn's opponents. Luckily, my tongue unfroze before the last 2 shifters could join in the fray, and my wolf's grudging support of my tardy command at last halted the carnage. But the damage had been done. Fawn's arm dangled at a sickening angle from her shoulder, and the battle lines within my pack had been clearly drawn. Finally, adding insult to injury, Thomas Bell took one last look back at our fraying pack, then shook his head and strode away into the tree line without speaking a single word. I wish I could say that what I did next was spurred by passionate temper, but I'm afraid that, in the aftermath of Fawn's injury, I was as cold and hard of an alpha as ever my father had been. Everyone knew that Drew had to be punished, and if I wanted to even pretend that I was this pack's leader, I was the one who would have to carry out that punishment. Plus, to make matters worse, werewolves believed in an eye for an eye justice, or in this case an arm for an arm. So even though I had hoped to end this night without more bloodshed, my teeth were the ones next responsible for puncturing skin. Shift, I commanded my unruly cousin, and the single word was as hard as flint, backed by wolf and human alike. Drew fell to the ground as his body reformed itself into a human against his conscious volition, and when the shifter rose to his knees at last, his chest was heaving from the effort of fighting against a forced shift. For those who weren't as fully in tune with their wolf as I was, our transformations were always slightly painful, and I imagined the discomfort was much worse if you were made to change forms against your will. But that was just the start of the agony I planned to inflict upon my cousin. Keeping my eyes firmly latched onto Drew's, I allowed my own body to melt into lupin form, and without pausing I walked slowly forward, deliberately closed my jaws around Drew's upper arm, and then clenched my teeth together until I could feel blood oozing from the sore Finally, as my cousin's arm twitched. Within my mouth I bit down yet harder until Drew was screaming in pain and I could feel his bones splintering between my teeth. Releasing my prey as deliberately as I'd begun, I spat my cousin's salty blood out onto the forest floor, and then regained human form. The pain I'd created reverberated just as strongly through my bones as Fawn's had, proving that "this hurts me more than it hurts you" was literally true for pack leaders. And my human half was sickened by what I'd been forced to do, forcing me to close my eyes for a moment in order to squelch the nausea that churned through my gut. When I was finally able to shake the groggy pain out of my body, I was glad to see that Fawn had already shifted back to lupin form, the action resetting her bone, although not healing the break. Wade and David were working to create a crude splint from 2 branches and some frayed vine fibers, and my Uncle Hawk was preparing a similar dressing for Drew, which left my 2 troublesome uncles to deal with. My father, I knew, would have repeated the arm-breaking exercise in order to discipline both of these shifters in the same way I'd chastened Drew, but even my inner wolf cringed at the extremity of such a punishment. After all, my uncles hadn't actually caused any physical harm, and it could have been argued that they jumped into the fight only to protect Drew from being torn apart by 2 overzealous defenders. On the other hand, I knew deep down in my gut that my uncle's actions had been meant as the first sally in a campaign to undermine my authority, added to which I suspected that, in the long run, 2 additional broken bones now might be kinder than letting my relative's insolence fester into a true division of leadership within the Wilder clan. Because assuming everyone didn't simply ally with my detractors and take me down in a pile of teeth and claws, a power struggle at the top of our pack would result in endless scuffles between neighbors lower down the social pyramid, the divisiveness growing until our clan had splintered into a dozen warring factions. I'd watched other packs descend into this kind of infighting before, our wolf nature making many shifters unable to hold themselves back from displays of dominance even if the ends didn't justify the means. And although some of my father's decisions had seemed overly harsh in the past, I knew that the chief's firm hand had protected my relatives from civil war. So I knew I should do the right thing and stop this bloodbath before it began. But I couldn't bring myself to do the deed. Instead, I simply set my uncles an arduous and time-consuming task and hoped that I would be able to find a way to further undermine their coup before it evolved any further. Wade, Fawn, David, and Hawk will come home with me and will attend all pack, I said clearly, my words carrying to every ear and stilling the aid workers' ministrations. Then, pushing the alpha dominance that I'd been forced to use multiple times already this night back into my voice, I finished, the rest of you can walk back to Haven and stay there. Chapter 10. I woke far too early due to the sound of timid tapping on my bedroom door. The members of my pack who had been allowed to ride home via motorized transport had returned to Haven in the wee hours of the morning, and for once none of us was interested in the dawn feast that usually followed our midnight hunt. Instead, we'd each gone straight to our respective beds, which I'd hoped would at least mean enjoying a good night's sleep before I had to put out any more metaphorical fires. However, my father clearly had other plans for this final day before our entourage headed to the regional gathering. Tara, Cricket's timid voice filtered through the wooden door, and I rose quickly to prevent my stepmother from waking fun. The young woman was usually unwilling to be set apart from her male companions by dint of preferential treatment, but she'd readily accepted the offer of my spare bed last night, proving that the Yahoo's pain and exhaustion was more extreme than she let on. It couldn't have been easy to limp home on 3 legs last night, but Fun had somehow managed to keep up with our descent down the mountain, never so much as uttering a single whimper of complaint. Still, the female Yahoo's lips had been white by the time we'd reached our cars, and I hoped she'd be able to rest and heal for a few more hours at least before embarking on 2 weeks of roughing it in a wintry campsite. So I grabbed my clothes as soon as I heard Cricket's voice, then I tiptoed outside, pulling the door closed behind me. As I emerged, I could immediately smell my father's scent wafting up the stairs from the lower level of the house. Oh goody, another visit from Crazy Wilder, I thought grimly. But there was no easy way to avoid my visitor, so I pattered barefoot down the stairs to face the music. Unfortunately, the ensuing confrontation had a larger-than-expected audience. Cricket's sitting room was already filled to the brim with my father in his rare human form plus a heaping handful of menacing wilder males by the time I came into view. Meanwhile my allies, the Yahoos, were notably absent, since the latter had spent the night camped out on the same sofas that my uncles and cousins were currently sprawled across. It was clear that this ambush had taken some effort to set up. Someone must have sent the Yahoos off on a wild goose chase and then assembled the ranks of my detractors at the crack of dawn, a sally that had my father's name written all over it. As I took in the scene in front of me, I saw that the chief was smiling and that his wolf danced with the glee of having pulled the wool over my eyes. In response, the least helpful emotion of all, anger, rose up within my breast. I'd rolled over and let my father manipulate me several times over the last few weeks, but something about this most recent entrapment felt like the straw that broke the camel's back. Perhaps my ire was raised because my father was working against his own best interests now, by berating me in front of the pack that I was so tenuously heading up. The chief would undermine my authority and make his entire scheme pointless, which in turn made my teeth grind in frustration. Why couldn't Crazy Wilder have simply left me alone and remained alpha himself if he so badly wanted to head up the Wilder pack? So I didn't even take the time to fully waken my wolf, and I certainly didn't bow down beneath the chief's cold stare the way I would have in the past. Instead, I stopped midway down the steps from which vantage point I towered above the room's inhabitants despite my smaller stature, and I let loose every grievance that had built up within my mind over the last few weeks. So you're here to tell me what to do again? I spat out, not caring if I sounded like a shrew. There was no longer any point in trying to beat my father at his games of alpha dominance, not since my other relatives' presence meant that I'd lost this fight before it truly began. Let me guess, I continued, taking the stairs two at a time as my rage drew me toward the object of my exasperation. You think attending all pack with a wounded woman and only 3 male shifters in my entourage is pure stupidity. You're going to tell me that I might as well just offer up my belly now and tell the other alphas to go ahead and tear out my entrails. By this point I had reached solid ground where everyone towered above my head, my father most of all, but I didn't care if I was physically outclassed. And if I could easily be dominated by my father's superior mental abilities. Was fed up with working so hard only to have the chief tell me over and over again that I'd misstepped, and if I was going to go down it would be a blaze of glory. The frustrating truth was that I'd thrown everything I had into pulling the Wilder clan back together over the last couple of months, and I was no longer willing for my father to tell me that my best wasn't good enough. I'd woken early and gone to bed late, had avoided contacting my own mate, and had even broken Drew's bones between my teeth despite never wanting to see another drop of blood in my entire life. All of this to mop up the disaster that my father had left behind. And the chief thought that, despite all of my pain and suffering, it was a good idea to berate me in front of the very people whom he wanted me to lead? So I spoke my mind at last, all the while waiting for the other shoe to drop. Well, I've had it with you thinking you can lead this pack through me, I told my father, jabbing him in the chest with one hard finger. If you're so sure that you can do a better job, then challenge me and see what happens. And if you're too afraid to step up to a fight, then get out of this house and leave me alone. My last words descended into a tone of quiet menace that I knew I couldn't physically back up, but I really didn't care at that point. I was done with being the chief's puppet, and if my father wanted to take this pack away from me, then I would cheer and kiss the old shifter on both cheeks in gratitude. Then I'd skip off into the sunset with my mate and with the hodgepodge of werewolves who were already starting to feel more like family than my own did. Finishing my rant, I waited, sure that my father would call my bluff, and for a solid minute we stood there nose to nose, or rather nose to collarbone. Then my father simply shrugged and turned to leave. On your head be it, he said simply, and to my surprise, the ranks of angry uncles and cousins filed out behind him without a word of complaint. Meanwhile, I was left staring with my mouth wide open in disbelief, as, even though it felt far too easy, it seemed that I had won. I wasn't entirely sure that my father had actually capitulated rather than simply having wandered off to scheme at his leisure, but as the day progressed, and everyone I met hopped to obey my commands, I slowly began to relax. Perhaps I really had stood up to my father and come out of the altercation triumphant. Perhaps I really could find a way to hold the Wilder clan together without losing myself in the process. Perhaps Alpac wouldn't be so bad. After all. Of course, I should have known that my decisions wouldn't all go unchallenged. But at first, the day seemed to be getting brighter rather than cloudier. When the male Yahoo showed back up after lunch, cheeks red from what must have been an enjoyable run, I could smell the scent of blood on their human skins. These happy-go-lucky werewolves had made up for the anticlimactic nature of yesterday's hunt by finding a simpler prey animal to tear into shreds. A deer? If I didn't miss my guess. And while I envied the young shifters' simple good humor, their smiling faces also brought some much-needed cheer to my own mood. I hope you brought back something for Cricket to cook into our dinner, I told the Yahoos sternly, but I couldn't maintain my acerbity and instead ended up smiling at the puppy-like grins on all three guys' faces. The simplicity of Wolfie's pack mates made my own wilder relatives look even worse in comparison, and I wish that I could have simply thrown in the towel and let someone else take over my familial clan. But the relatives like Hawk who would have ruled fairly weren't the ones who would willingly fight for power, and I shivered to think what Haven would turn into if Drew or one of his cronies took control. So I would keep fighting the uphill battle to take my father's place, but at least I could spend a little piece of today with Wolfie's youngsters in order to soak up their joie de vivre. What are your plans for the rest of the morning? I asked, once Wade had assured me that they'd saved not only the haunches, but also the tenderloin to be cooked up in my stepmother's kitchen. The guys exchanged glances, and then the youngest spoke. We were thinking of going to see Sarah. She seemed kinda lonely the other day. Instantly, my big-picture ruminations gave way to the necessities of the present, and I narrowed my eyes at Blaze, assessing his honesty. Sure. Werewolves were pack animals, and we didn't do well in solitary confinement. But I suspected that my Aunt Bev was keeping Sarah quite happy and healthy all on her own. In the meantime, if the girl wanted to talk to someone closer to her own age, David would be just down the hall. So I suspected that the purpose of the Yahoo's visit had less to do with humanitarian aid and more to do with Blaze's crush on Justin's cast-off mate. In which case the question became, should I try to stifle the pairing before it truly began? Politically, having one of our Yahoos hook up with Sarah would cause problems, since Justin was just the sort of alpha who wouldn't want anyone else laying hands on his ex-mate, even if the shifter no longer considered the girl to be worth his while to house and feed. But I was already dealing with plenty of political problems, so one small additional issue barely raised my eyebrows. Instead, my biggest consideration was trying to figure out what would make my own pack happiest. Blaze was young and hot-headed, but he was also loyal and lovable, and I figured that Sarah could do much worse than having a shifter like him as her mate. In addition, I suspected that another werewolf in her corner might make Sarah more likely to fight for her life in the battle that loomed on the horizon, and the girl would definitely need all of the odds tilted in her favor if she was going to survive. So I shrugged off my reservations and didn't make waves, but I did opt to join the Yahoos in checking on our guest. And that was my biggest mistake of the day, because Sarah would never have built up the courage to come to me on her own. So if I just begged off from that visit, then half of the drama during the ensuing week would never have occurred. But that's 2020 hindsight, which never did anyone any good. And at the time I thought it would be a nice gesture for the reigning alpha to make sure that our guest was settling into her new home. So I tagged along and started the chain of events that would eventually lead to even more pain and suffering. I'm glad you came by, my aunt greeted us as our foursome filed into her living room once again. Fawn was still ensconced in Cricket's upstairs room, her lupin nature making it easy to enter a state of hibernation in preparation for the effort that was to come. But Wade and Glenn had opted to join us rather than letting me and Blaze visit Sarah alone, and this time they'd even remembered to wipe their feet on Bev's welcome mat. How's your patient feeling? I responded for the group, noticing that my aunt hadn't lowered her voice the way I would have outside Fawn's sickroom door. Hope that the midwife's normal tone meant that Sarah was feeling better, and my wish was soon borne out when the girl in question came pattering down the hallway with sleekly brushed hair and even a dash of makeup on her cheeks and lips. In fact, our guest was in such perky good health that I almost thought Bev had planted another young werewolf to take the place of the wilting flower, whom I'd met just a few days before. But when I peered closer with my lupin, I could see that there was still a spark of life within Sarah's womb, and that the spark definitely boasted a tail. So our guest wasn't healed, but at least she was feeling much better. I'm doing great, Sarah answered, confirming my assessment. The girl's voice was still quiet, but her stance no longer suggested that she expected us to turn into wolves and rend her limb from limb at one wrong word, which was definitely a sign of improvement. Thanks for coming, she continued, speaking to me and ignoring the way Blaze's eyes followed her every mood hungrily. Actually, I was hoping to speak with you before Allpack, she added quietly, yet firmly, so I'm glad you dropped by. If there's anything you need. I started, but Sarah didn't give me time to finish. The girl had obviously put a great deal of thought into her request, and needed to get the words out before I could shoot her down, so I didn't even growl at being spoken over, something that I suspect the chief had never allowed to happen in his entire career as Alpha. I want to go with you to the gathering, the girl said, then took a deep breath and hastened to explain. I know there's a good chance that my baby and I won't survive childbirth, but if we do, we'll need somewhere to go, a family to become a part of. So I want to attend Allpack as a pack princess. A pack princess, an eligible young girl seeking a mate. And you thought the female selection for Allpack would be the easy part, my wolf snickered, silently tossing my own words back in my face. My wolf was right. I had thought that the lack of pack princesses in the Wilder clan would make my life easier, and to be honest, I still felt like there were no eligible young women whom we should bring with us, as, while I hated to tell this girl no, Sarah's idea was misguided on so many levels. First, there was her health. Bev had told me that Sarah needed to stay calm until the baby was born, and our regional gathering never lacked for stimulation. Then there was the issue of Justin, who would have to become my ally no matter what kind of concessions it took to win his aid, especially now that Thomas Bell had written me off as a viable alpha. And while I'd been willing to put up with the political repercussions of Sarah choosing Blaze as her new mate, I had also been hoping to put that drama off until next year, when my hold over the Wilder clan would be a little more sturdy and less likely to crack into a million tiny pieces. On the other hand, Wolfie had given Sarah into my care, and I didn't want to let my mate down. I hope you know that you have a place with us for as long as you want it, I told the girl, trying to make her feel more secure in our pack. Perhaps I could ease whatever crazy whim made the girl think that going to Allpack 9 months pregnant made sense. But Sarah simply looked away as I spoke, her wolf seeming to droop beneath her skin as girl and Lupin alike succumbed to disappointment. I glanced at Bev in search of support, but my aunt simply shrugged her shoulders, as torn as I was about whether to let the girl have her head. There's no real reason why she can't go, the midwife confirmed eventually. It would be better for Sarah not to be upset, but she doesn't absolutely have to be on bed rest. As I weighed our guests' wishes and needs, Blaze spoke up. I'd be glad to be part of your honor guard, the Yahoo said, his voice drawing our guests' eyes. At last, the object of Blaze's attention smiled prettily in response, and the Yahoo's cheeks turned bright red at her regard. You and David both, the girl agreed. I'd like that. And I was so sick of being the bad guy that, even though I knew Sarah would be better off if she remained here in Haven, I agreed. And so I made a decision that I would soon come to regret.